Who here cares about climate change? Can I have a hands in the air? Hands in the air? Right at the back? Good. The awkward thing is that I don't actually really care about climate change very much, and I want you not to care as well. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a quick story and bring you into my world. So it's the middle of June in 2005. I'm 13, and I'm standing in the middle of a small market town near where I lived in North Yorkshire. It's a Sunday evening, and it's getting late after a scorching summer's day out with my parents. And then very suddenly, dark clouds begin to form, and the sky turns an ill shade of green. Thunder rumbles around the market town, and the heavy rain starts to fall. Now, little did I know at the time, but this was going to be one of the worst floods on record to hit northern England, and I was at the middle of it. Now, after being stuck in the floods for a few hours in the darkness, we eventually got home, and I remember watching the news early that morning and seeing the damage to my community. But then a scientist came on and said that because of climate change, events like these would increase in frequency and severity. And since then, climate change has been part of my life, and I started action. And I was absolutely fascinated by climate change. I promoted scientific awareness of it, how it happens, why it happens, the atmospheric chemistry of the problem, glaciers, sea level, and so on. And I talked to my school friends and my community about it, both of whom hadn't really heard about climate change back in 2005. And I fundamentally believed that education was the solution to this problem. I thought if people understood this, of course they would do something. And since that time, I've worked with Tony Blair on policy innovation to get climate change on the UK school curriculum. I've talked about climate change at frontline political forums like the United Nations. I've fronted media campaigns that have reached over 3 million people. And I've seen the impacts of climate change on amazing but fragile communities around the world. And in the 11 years since I started, people know significantly more about climate change than they did. But still not enough people care. And even with the Paris Agreement last year, I don't think that's going to make that much of a difference. You see, I think I've been wrong through all my years of teenage activism. And let's just try a little test here in this room. I want you to think now, what are the words that you think of when someone says climate change? Have you all got something? Now, I'd be very surprised if the words you're thinking of right now aren't on the slide behind me. Green growth might be one, that's a very Norwegian thing, but in communities I talk to around the world, these reliably come up as the most common words used to talk about climate change, from experts to people who know very little. And these buzzwords convey a very scientific understanding of climate change. Why should we care about them? I don't think we should. You see, I think I was wrong about education on climate change by focusing too much on communicating the science. Because you see, tackling climate change really isn't an issue of saving the planet. Ultimately, the planet will be fine. It's us that we have to be concerned about. And each of our everyday lives are intimately and inextricably linked to the physical landscape of the planet. But in our busy, our tech-dominated and often urban lifestyles, it's very easy to become disconnected with the natural world around us. And I've noticed it myself as I've moved from the northeast of England down to London. And when I talk to people around the world, especially sort of Europe and the US, very few people see how climate change is affecting them. They see it as this distant threat. They see melting ice and polar bears. They see floods in countries far, far away, or they see the impact of climate change far into the future. And the harsh truth is that very few people care about this side of climate change. So if we shouldn't be talking about climate change like this, what should we be doing? Now, I think we should be educating about what is already happening. How are you being affected now? How are your lives being changed? People like you, everyday decisions, these sort of terms. And in a developed world, we often use the term climate justice an awful lot. And this is the idea that we, the developed world, are causing the problem, but not really being affected by it. Now, this is incredibly wrong. We just need to reassess what climate change actually is. A 2014 report from PwC actually indicated that the indirect impacts of climate change are likely to massively outweigh the direct. And by indirect impacts, I mean the invisible ones, the ones which are hard to see. You know, we're talking about economic, security, health, political implications, which generally follow on from the direct impact, such as a flood or the drought or the hurricane or whatever it may be. So you see, I don't care about what most people associate as climate change. I care about the very real implications it has for me and people like me. Now, what I've said so far probably won't be new to a lot of you in this room, because all of you, by the very nature of being here, I'm assuming, care deeply about climate change, and you already get this. But what I want to give you tonight are a few ideas on how to communicate to climate change to people who aren't in this room, to people who might feel very disconnected with climate change, to people who don't know very little about climate change, people who don't care about climate change, people who don't think it's their problem, people who think there are much bigger issues to deal with in this remarkable year of 2016. Because over the past year we've seen signs of our world dividing and cracking apart. And a lot of people are deeply unhappy. These are the losers of globalization, and we can no longer hide from the growing discontent in the world. I feel that a lot of us have been blinkered as we convince ourselves in halls like this one that everything is fine and we're somehow all in agreement. But when you go beyond your social circle and touch a wider reality, you see that we have an awful lot of work still to do. We are absolutely moving forward, but we just need a bit of a reality check to the people that we're leaving behind. Now, I tend to use frames when I'm talking about climate change to someone new, and I think of frames as a different lens or a story. They draw out certain elements of climate change and discard others. Because climate change as an issue is so big, you need to break it down a bit. But the one frame that so many of us automatically jump to is that scientific one, hitting all of those buzzwords. But that most certainly isn't the most effective frame to use when talking to people. Because something about climate change matters to everyone. Find out more about the person or community you're talking to. Really listen and find out what stories or facts would make them care about climate change. Now, to do this, you really need to listen yourself. Find out about your audience's core values, what they care about, and how climate change will affect that. And make it as specific as possible. Why should a beach volleyball team in Stavanger care? Why should a small hotel owner in Tromsø care? And one of the frames for an individual or homeowner might be something like food, looking at how climate change might affect access to food and destabilizing prices. For businesses, we could explore something like how sustainable business generally means efficiency, how you can reduce waste and save costs. As Anthony Hobley said earlier today, looking at the lens of stranded assets and through a financial lens, you know, how we can adapt supply chains and make supply chains resilient to climate risk makes complete business sense. And this green growth frame, which we're talking so much about today, is such an exciting one. And I have to say that business is the group of people which excites me the most at the moment. And corporates have the power and the energy, and young people have the vision and the passion. And I welcome conversations with any of you tonight or ongoing about how we can make that happen. But in recent circumstances, I think it would be rude not to talk about this man who has been mentioned a few times today, and it is something sadly we can't ignore. What would make Donald Trump care about climate change? What frames would work with a protectionist government or an anti-establishment movement? Because we do need to get Trump or his supporters on board with investment in renewables, because it is a huge demographic. And actually, a lot of what they care about isn't that disaligned with what we care about. Perhaps we could use a frame of how investment in renewables could help create an energy-independent America. The frame of how we can create skilled jobs in white working class communities which have suffered industrial decline. The frame of how eliminating fossil fuel subsidies would allow the market to decide what to do. The frame of how conflict might increase with climate change, which would increase military intervention. And these are just a few ideas, but I'm just saying that we can discuss all of this without directly arguing about the science of that Chinese hoax. Now, that is not to say that we should compromise on our values when talking to people like this, but just the fact that we have a duty to better communicate climate change. Because something about climate change matters to everyone. It isn't climate change, it's everything change. Listen to people, find out what they care about, what is precious to them, and find out how climate change will impact that, as I guarantee it will in some way. Stop trying to get people to care about climate change and focus on what they already care about. Thank you very much.